The Belvedere Hotel was lit up gold that night, and the woman sitting on its front steps had nothing but a coat, 2 sizes too big, and a hand held out to strangers. The staff called her Mira. She wasn't even sure that was her name. She wasn't asking loudly. She just kept saying, over and over, that she hadn't taken anything from anyone. Then a woman in a silver gown came down the steps, smelling of jasmine, grabbed her wrist, and told the whole crowd this beggar had stolen a bracelet. The slap cracked across the plaza like a door slamming shut. Phones went up. People stopped walking. And Elias Marchetti, 34 years old, gray-eyed, a thin scar splitting his left eyebrow, the man to whom half of Chicago bowed without knowing why, looked down at that dirty, tarnished wrist and stopped breathing. A thin silver bracelet. A small charm shaped like a lighthouse. He'd had it made himself, one of a kind, never photographed, never described in any article, with an inscription inside the band that only 2 living people had ever read. And the last time he'd seen it, it was on the wrist of his wife, who'd walked out to her car on a rainy Tuesday 5 years ago, and never arrived anywhere at all. He was on his knees on the wet stone, before he understood he'd moved. The woman on the ground lifted her head, and her eyes caught on the scar above his eye the way a key catches in a lock, and she said his name. Not sir, not please, she said Elias, and then, softer, confused, like someone waking up in the wrong house, she asked him why the light was off. If a story about loyalty and about the people we walk past without ever really seeing means something to you, give this video a like and share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because it means a lot to know you're out there. Now let's go back to that cold October night in Chicago and find out who she really was. Cordelia Vance heard clearly the name that had just slipped from the mouth of the woman sitting on the ground. And the first thing she did was laugh. A short, sharp laugh that circled through the people standing nearest, trying to pull them to her side. She told the whole square that everyone in Chicago knew his name, that it was carved across the fronts of half the buildings from there to the river, that anyone sleeping on the street could memorize it in a single afternoon. She said this was an act, that people like this always knew how to choose the right night when cameras were present, and that if someone bothered to search that coat, they would find plenty of other things that didn't belong to her. No one laughed with her. That was what Cordelia realized more slowly than everyone else. Elias didn't answer her. He didn't even turn his head in her direction. He remained on one knee, the other touching the wet stone. And when he spoke to the security manager standing a few steps away, in a voice so low that the man had to lean forward to hear the entire sentence. He told him to close the main entrance. He told him to bring the guests in through the side door. He told him that no one was to pass through this place for the next 15 minutes. The security manager didn't ask a single question. He only nodded. And what happened next was something the guests that night would talk about for a very long time afterward. The line of people waiting to enter the gala, people in evening clothes, people who had just stepped out of chauffeur-driven cars, people accustomed to having doors open before they could even raise a hand, all of them spread apart to either side. No one ordered them to move. No one pushed them. They simply stepped back, like water receding from a hollow, and in the space that opened between the steps and the curb, the noise of an entire festive evening faded almost completely away. People still held up their phones, but no one spoke. Elias removed the cloak he was wearing, carefully, like a man afraid of dropping something, then laid it over the woman's shoulders. She flinched by instinct, her shoulders drawing inward, her chin pressing down toward her chest, the way a person folds into herself after growing accustomed to being touched without warning. Then she stopped. She lowered her face toward the collar, breathed in very slowly, and her whole body loosened. She said she knew that scent. She added that she couldn't remember where she knew it from, but it didn't frighten her, and her voice when she said it sounded like someone apologizing because that was all she had to offer. Elias couldn't answer. He lowered his head slightly, only slightly, and Malachi Doyle, who stood closest, saw his shoulders tremble once and then go still. Cordelia stepped forward. She said he was humiliating himself in front of the entire city. She said 3 members of the board were present that night, along with reporters from 2 newspapers, and people who had spent months arranging for him to hold a respectable place in the public eye, and that he was about to throw all of it into the gutter because someone who slept on the street knew how to read the name on a building. She said that tomorrow no one would remember anything except this image. Elias rose to his feet. He didn't raise his voice. didn't step toward her, didn't do anything that 100 phones could record and turn into something useful to her. He simply turned and told her that she had just mentioned what other people would remember, and that was what she should begin worrying about, not him. Then he added that from that moment, until he gave permission, she wasn't to say another word about this woman. Not to him, not to the reporters, not to anyone inside that hall. He spoke in the same voice as before, the kind of voice a person had to lean closer to hear clearly. Cordelia stepped back. She hadn't meant to. Her foot moved before she could stop it, and she knew that at least 10 people had seen. The car eased up to the curb. Elias held out his hand, not taking hold of her, only offering it and waiting. And after such a long moment that Malachi thought she wouldn't move, she placed her grimy hand in his. She rose very slowly. She walked one step at a time, the cloak far too large and dragging behind her, and not one person in that crowd dared even cough. The car door closed. The car pulled away, and Cordelia Vance remained standing alone on the steps beneath the yellow light, surrounded by lenses still pointed in her direction, realizing that throughout the entire evening, not one person had stepped forward to stand beside her. To understand why a man like Elias Marchetti would kneel on wet stone before an entire city, one must go back to the years when he was still nothing more than the son of a dying man, and to a community clinic tucked away in the heart of Pilsen, where there was a nurse named Adeline Whitlock. Adeline's work wasn't to save people. She worked in hospice care, which meant that everyone brought to her had already passed beyond the point where medicine still had anything left to say. Her job was to stay, to sit with those who were about to leave while their children lived on the far coast, to sit with elderly men who had no one left to call, to spend an entire night shift beside the beds of strangers, and hold their hands when their breathing began to grow faint and far apart. She carried a hardbound notebook in the pocket of her white coat, and inside it she wrote down whatever people wanted their families to know. Some dictated an entire letter to her. Some could manage only a few words. One elderly woman asked only that Adeline remind her daughter to turn off the gas stove before leaving the house. And Adeline copied down every word exactly as if it were a final will, then truly sent the message. She had been doing that work for years before Elias walked into the clinic corridor, and she did it for one very simple reason she never explained to anyone, because she believed no one deserved to leave this life in a room where there was no one to hear them speak. Elias's father lay in the last room at the end of the hall. The old man had lost his voice several days earlier, and on the day Elias arrived, the entire floor was crowded with strangers in dark clothing standing along the walls. The clinic staff took other routes to avoid them. Some asked to change shifts. One nursing aide carried a tray with hands trembling so badly that she dropped a glass of water in the middle of the corridor, then simply stood there staring at the floor, too frightened even to bend down and pick it up. Elias was not yet 30 then, and he already carried the kind of presence that made other people step aside without being told. He had come to receive whatever his father had said during his final days. Adeline was the one who brought out the notebook. She didn't knock and wait at the threshold like everyone else. She walked straight into the room, pulled out a chair, sat across from him, opened to the exact page written in her own hand, and read it aloud from beginning to end without leaving out a single word, including the sentences that someone far more cautious would have chosen to omit. When she finished, she closed the notebook and told him that the old man had spoken of him more than anyone else, and that she believed he ought to know that. Then she asked whether he would like some water. Elias later told her that it was the strangest question anyone had ever asked him, because there had been dozens of people on that floor that day, and she was the only one among them who wasn't afraid of him. On the night his father died, the family broke into pieces right there in the waiting room. People who had sat at the same table for years beginning to look at one another as if they were strangers, and Elias walked away. He told no one where he was going. He disappeared for several days, long enough for some people to begin calculating how the shares might be divided, and when he returned, the house was completely dark, without a single light in any window except for the porch lamp still burning above the front steps. Adeline sat beneath that light, wrapped in a coat, both hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before. She didn't spring to her feet. She didn't ask where he had been, and she didn't ask what he had done. She only moved aside to make room for him to sit, then said that she wasn't asking, she was only leaving the light on. He sat beside her on the steps for a very long time, without being able to say a word. On the day they married, there was no grand celebration and no photograph in the newspapers, only a quiet afternoon with a few people they trusted. Elias gave her a box, and inside it was a slender silver bracelet with a small lighthouse pendant. He had commissioned it himself, the only one of its kind, and he had instructed the jeweler to engrave a line around the inside of the bracelet, saying that no matter how long the night might be, he would still leave the light on for her. No one except the two of them knew that inscription existed. It appeared in none of their wedding photographs, was mentioned in none of the articles later written about him, and even the people closest to Elias had never heard him speak of it. Adeline wore that bracelet every day, even during her shifts, even while her hands were holding the hand of a stranger in the final hour of their life. And from that night onward, the porch light of their home was never turned off. The last message Adeline ever sent her husband arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, so brief that he finished reading it in less than a single breath. And many years later, he still kept it on his phone without deleting it. She wrote that she needed to tell him something, that it couldn't be said over the phone, and that she would wait for him at their usual place. Elias replied that he was on his way. She didn't answer again. He didn't find that strange, because she often turned off her phone while driving in the rain. Her car was found before dawn the next morning in the parking lot beneath the bridge, in the darkest corner of the grounds, where the streetlight had been broken for so long that the city had stopped caring enough to replace it. The driver's door stood wide open, and rainwater had gathered in pools across the floor mat. Her handbag was still resting untouched on the passenger seat. Her money was all there. Her bank cards were all there. And the hardbound notebook she always carried was there as well, lying open to a blank page. Her phone was powered off beneath the seat. There were no signs of a struggle. No one had seen anything. The rain had fallen so heavily that night that none of the nearby cameras captured anything clearer than blurred streaks of light. The police opened a file, questioned a few people, then did what every system does when it has nothing solid to hold on to. They moved the case to the bottom of the stack. Elias didn't wait. But he didn't search for his wife the way an ordinary husband would. He searched with exactly what he had in his hands. Within a few weeks, he tore apart 2 agreements already signed with other families, agreements his father had spent a lifetime building, simply because he needed their people to open doors into places where he had no right to enter. He forced a transportation company into bankruptcy in less than a season, closing its warehouses one by one, because one of its drivers had lied to him about a vehicle parked beneath the bridge that night, and it was later discovered that the driver had lied only because he was afraid of losing his job and had nothing at all to do with Adeline. Elias paid men he once wouldn't have bothered to sit beside at a table. He entered neighborhoods his cars had never passed through before. In the process, he lost 2 trusted men, 2 men who had followed his father since before any building bore the Marchetti name, and no one in the family dared ask him a single question about it. Malachi Doyle was the only person who ever spoke plainly to his face. He said Elias had burned nearly half the city to find one woman, had alienated men his father had needed 30 years to bring under control, and in the end he was still empty-handed, without a name, an address, or even a single line to follow. Elias didn't argue. He only told Malachi to keep looking. Then time did what it always does with another person's grief. It turned the story into an old piece of news. People stopped speaking of it. The newspapers moved on to other cases, and into that silence came Cordelia Vance, not by forcing her way in, but by sitting down. She began at the lowest level, taking on the work no one else wanted. When Adeline disappeared, she had left behind a small unfinished fund, a volunteer project meant to provide community clinics in Pilsen with more beds for patients nearing the end of their lives, and the fund was about to die with her. Cordelia took it over. She attended the meetings in her place, signed the papers in her place, and paid the wages of employees who were preparing to leave. Then she expanded it. From a small fund, it became a chain of clinics. From a chain of clinics, it became a network of nursing homes spread across the suburbs, each one bearing Cordelia's own surname on its sign. People began calling her the woman who had saved the fund from being forgotten. No one noticed that she never once spoke the name of the woman who had created it. Uncle Ambrose didn't speak about charity. He spoke about the family. He sat down with Elias again and again, calling him son as he had since Elias was a boy, and told him that a name like Marchetti couldn't be left hanging forever in a state of uncertainty, that there needed to be a respectable marriage, a respectable image, a future people could look at without lowering their voices. He said the one who had gone was already gone. And the gala night at the Belvedere Hotel, the night the entire city watched a woman being slapped on the stone steps, was supposed to have been the night Cordelia Vance stepped onto the stage and announced her engagement. The car hadn't gone 3 blocks before Elias had to tell the driver to pull over. The woman sitting across from him had begun breathing too quickly, both hands pressed against the window, and he realized that the problem wasn't him, and it wasn't the speed, but the dark glass enclosing her on all four sides. She couldn't see outside. She said she didn't know where they were taking her, and she repeated it several times, faster each time, until Elias lowered every window himself. Even though the night was cold and the October wind blew straight into the car, he told her she could look outside for as long as she needed. He didn't take her to the large house on the north side of the city, as he had first intended. He changed the plan while they were still in the car, made one call, and someone opened a small apartment for him on the second floor of an old building overlooking a park, a place with wooden stairs that creaked and windows through which she could see trees. There was nothing expensive in the apartment, and that was precisely why he chose it. Malachi Doyle stationed men on the street below and in the hallway, but no one was allowed inside. When someone laid out a meal on the table, the woman remained pressed into a corner of the room for a long time before she dared sit down. She said her name was Mira. She said that was what people called her. And when Elias asked who called her that, she thought for a very long time before saying everyone did, that they had simply called her that for so long she had grown used to it. At first, she ate very slowly, one small bite at a time, as though testing whether someone might snatch the food away. Then, when no one did anything, she began eating faster, then faster still, and halfway through the meal, she stopped, set down her spoon, straightened her back, and deliberately began eating slowly again, the way people correct themselves when they realize someone is watching. When she had finished, she took the cloth napkin from the table, wrapped the remaining bread inside it, folded it into a neat square, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She did it naturally, without trying to hide it, and without embarrassment, like a motion she had repeated through so many winters that it was no longer a decision. Elias remained still until she was finished. He told her that this was her home for as long as she wished, and that she didn't owe anyone anything in return. Then he asked permission to step outside. He walked to the end of the hallway, to the hidden space behind the staircase where she couldn't see him from inside the apartment. And there he leaned against the wall and slowly slid down to the floor. Malachi stood a few steps away, turned his face in the other direction, and said nothing for the entire time. Dr. Priya Raghavan arrived the next morning alone, without an assistant and without a white coat. She spent nearly half the morning simply sitting and talking before she was allowed to touch her patient. The examination revealed nothing that would have surprised anyone who had seen the woman sitting on the hotel steps. She had suffered from malnutrition for many years. Her teeth had decayed from lack of care. Her knees and feet bore the marks of walking too far for far too long. But there were two things Dr. Raghavan recorded with particular care. The first was evidence of an old head injury, so old that its exact date couldn't be determined, healed in the way wounds heal when no one ever treats them. The second was a form of memory loss she described as dissociative amnesia, meaning that the memories hadn't disappeared because the tissue of the brain was damaged, but because something inside the patient had closed a door and never opened it again. The doctor told Elias that in cases like this, memories were often not truly gone. They had merely been put away. In her notes, she listed 3 additional things she couldn't explain, and stated plainly that she couldn't yet explain them. The patient reacted violently to the scent of jasmine, so strongly that a bottle of perfume opened at the far end of the room was enough to make her spring to her feet. The patient reacted to the sound of a metal key turning in a lock, and when someone accidentally locked the bathroom door with a little too much force, she stood frozen in the middle of the room, unable to move for nearly a full minute. And the patient reacted to the sound of a child crying, a sound that drifted up from the park across the street one afternoon and caused her to retreat into the corner and cover both ears. In addition, she wouldn't allow anyone to touch her left wrist, even to take her blood pressure. And there the doctor observed a faint band of calloused skin encircling it, the mark of something that had once been worn too tightly for too long. At the end of the visit, Dr. Raghavan slid a sheet of paper and a pen across the table and asked her to write her name. She picked up the pen naturally, with the grip of someone who had once written often. She formed the first letter, then stopped. She stared down at the page for a very long time, long enough that Elias had to close his hand tightly around the arm of his chair. Then she continued writing, and the name that appeared on the paper was Mira. She pushed the page toward the doctor, apologized, and said that her hand was used to it now. The problem Malachi Doyle raised that very evening was simple and cruel, that no one could take the fingerprints of a person who wouldn't allow anyone to touch her. He said that all they had at the moment was a silver bracelet, and a name spoken by someone who couldn't remember her own. And that if this ever had to be placed before any authority, those two things wouldn't be enough to stand against a document prepared by a lawyer. He suggested a way. He described it in the calm voice of a man who had done such things many times before, and nothing in his tone suggested that he believed he was proposing anything terrible. The next morning, Dr. Raghavan carried a clear glass into the room, filled it with water, set it beside the patient's hand, and told her she needed to drink more. The woman lifted the glass with both hands, emptied it, then placed it back on the table and said thank you. Half an hour later, that glass was inside a paper bag in Malachi's car. Elias had known about it before it happened. He had listened to Malachi explain. He had nodded, and he hadn't said anything more. But when he stood in the hallway and watched Malachi descend the stairs with the paper bag in his hand, something rose inside his chest that he couldn't name. He had allowed someone to take something from his wife's hands without asking her a single question. He had done to the woman sitting in that room exactly what he had always ordered done to people he needed leverage over. Using the same procedure, the same cold efficiency, and he had done it so quickly that even he hadn't had time to feel disgusted with his own hands. He remained at the top of the stairs for a long time after Malachi had disappeared from sight. The results came back that same day. The fingerprints matched the state nursing license records of Adeline Whitlock, later Adeline Marchetti, with no margin of error left to dispute. But Malachi didn't bring the news with the expression of a man who had won. He placed the file on the table, pointed to the final section, and said there was something he didn't understand. Under normal circumstances, the professional license of someone who had been missing for years would have expired and been removed from the active system, the name transferred to an inactive category, and after enough time, the record would have been archived and no longer available through a direct search. This record wasn't like that. It remained intact. It remained active. It had been renewed regularly, year after year, without a single missed renewal, even during the years when the entire city had stopped speaking that name. Malachi said that was the only reason he had been able to find the match so quickly. Then he looked up at Elias. He didn't ask a question. He only looked at him, and the look lingered longer than necessary. Elias offered no explanation. He simply closed the file, pushed it aside, and told Malachi to keep this between the two of them. Then he went into the other room. The woman was sitting by the window, looking down at the row of trees across the street. He pulled out a chair and sat facing her, and the first thing he spoke of wasn't the name, wasn't the result, and wasn't a question. He told her that she didn't have to remember anything today. He said no one had the right to force her to remember, that she owed no one a single memory, and that if this was all she could remember for the rest of her life, that would be all right. She watched him for a moment, then asked why he was saying that. He told her it was because he was afraid someone else might tell her otherwise. Then he asked permission to step outside. In the hallway, he struck the brick wall beside the door with his fist once, then once again, and by the time Malachi came running, the knuckles of his right hand had split open, and blood had run all the way down to his cuff. He wouldn't allow anyone to bandage it until evening. That night, he returned to her room carrying his phone. Throughout all the years that had passed, he had continued paying to keep his wife's old number active, and one voicemail remained there that had never been deleted. He placed the phone on the table, pressed play, and Adeline's voice filled the small room, younger, quicker, with the noise of a hospital corridor faintly behind her. She said her shift was ending later than expected, that he mustn't fall asleep in the car like he had the last time, that she would come out as soon as she finished handing things over. And then she laughed, a brief laugh at the end of the sentence before the recording stopped. The woman sat motionless until it was over. She didn't cry. She looked at the phone for a long time, then raised her eyes and asked whether the woman had been happy, because she sounded so joyful. The ambulance arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, without a siren or flashing lights, pulled close to the curb in front of the old building overlooking the park, and shut off its engine. It belonged to a private company, painted white, with valid license plates, and the two people who stepped out wore the proper uniforms of a registered patient transport service. Malachi's man stationed on the street stopped them at the entrance. They showed no irritation. One of them reached inside his coat, took out a sheet of paper folded into thirds, opened it, and held it up. And that paper was the most frightening thing in everything that happened that night. It was an order transferring the patient to a compulsory treatment facility, signed by a licensed psychiatrist, with a case number and the red seal of the court. It stated that the patient was suffering from cognitive impairment, lacked the capacity to make decisions for herself, and was being kept in a private residence by an individual with no legally established relationship to her. Not a single sentence on that paper was false. Everything had been written in the proper place, on the proper form, in full accordance with the law. Maliki read it once from beginning to end, then read it again, and throughout that time he couldn't think of anything to say. But he wasn't the one who understood what was happening. On the second floor, the woman had been awake from the moment the vehicle pulled up to the curb. She rose from the bed and walked toward the bedroom door, and by the time the two people reached the stair landing, she was already standing there. She didn't look at the paper in their hands. She didn't look at their faces. She only drew in a breath, then stepped backward, and backward again, until her back touched the farthest corner of the room. And from there she managed to say only one sentence, that they had come from that place. She spoke in the voice of someone who had just realized she was still trapped inside a dream she believed she had woken up from. Maliki asked what place she meant, but she couldn't answer. She only repeated the same sentence, and her eyes never left the collar of the man standing nearest to her, where a faint stain of perfume carried the scent of jasmine. Elias arrived in less than 10 minutes. He took the paper and read it very slowly, and at once he understood what Maliki had already understood. He couldn't tear it apart. He couldn't drive those two people away. He could buy the entire building before sunrise. He could force a transportation company into bankruptcy within a single season. But he could do nothing against a piece of paper bearing a red court seal, because if he interfered, another order would arrive by noon the next day, this time accompanied by the police. And then she truly would be taken away. The power before which half the city bowed had suddenly become worth no more than the paper folded into thirds in his hand. And that was when Elias Marchetti was most dangerous. He didn't raise his voice. He handed the paper back to the man, told both of them to wait in the hallway, then went downstairs and began making calls. During the next 20 minutes, no one laid a finger on anyone. The first call went to the owner of the building where the clinic that had issued the document rented its space. A man who had owed Elias's father a favor for many years and had never been asked to repay it. Before sunrise, the clinic's lease was terminated, and it was ordered to remove all its equipment from the premises within 3 days. The second call went to a lawyer whose name alone was enough to keep other people awake at night, and no one knew whom that lawyer called next, only that before dawn, the psychiatrist who had signed the order personally filed a request to withdraw it, citing that the case had been prepared using incomplete information. The third call was the shortest, and after it ended, the owner of the ambulance company called his 2 employees directly and ordered them to leave the building at once, without argument and without questions. The 2 of them descended the stairs between 2 silent lines of men, and no one reached out to stop or shove them. The white vehicle started its engine and disappeared around the corner before the sky had begun to lighten. Elias went back up to the second floor. The woman was still sitting in the corner of the room, with both arms wrapped around her knees, and she didn't move from that place until he pulled over a chair and sat down at a distance that was close enough for her to hear him, but far enough that she wouldn't feel trapped. He didn't tell her what he had just done. He only said, in a voice so quiet that she had to raise her head to hear him, that no one was taking her anywhere. While the white vehicle was leaving the building by the park, on the other side of the city, Cordelia Vance had remained awake through a second consecutive night. The video filmed on the hotel steps had made its way across all of Chicago, and then begun again from the start. And by morning, it was no longer merely a video, but something with a life of its own. People cut it apart, slowed it down, froze it at the exact moment her face twisted, then played it over and over again. Some added music. Others placed it beside photographs of her cutting ribbons at the nursing facilities that carried her name, where she stood among elderly people in wheelchairs and smiled directly into the camera. By noon, 2 organizations that had once received funding from her issued statements saying they were reviewing their partnerships. By afternoon, her communications director had called 4 times, and she hadn't answered once. What kept her from picking up wasn't humiliation. She had lived long enough in that city to know humiliation had an expiration date, that all it took was the divorce of someone more famous, or a scandal at City Hall, and everything would wash away. What kept her sitting in her unlit office throughout the afternoon was the call that had come early that morning, from a number she had deleted from her phone years ago, and still knew by heart. She recognized it from the first 3 digits. She let it ring through once, and when it rang a second time, she answered. The man on the other end didn't say hello. He didn't ask how she was, didn't mention the video, and didn't refer to anything happening across the screens. He only repeated the very words she had once said to him, that the woman would never be able to return. And he repeated them slowly, one word at a time, exactly the way someone rereads a clause in a contract to the person who has just broken it. Cordelia replied that the woman didn't remember anything. She said she had stood less than a step away from her, had looked directly into her eyes, and there had been nothing there, no recognition, no hatred, not a single flicker to suggest that she knew whom she was looking at. She said the woman couldn't even remember her own name. The voice on the other end fell silent for a moment. Then he asked her one question. If the woman remembered nothing, why had Elias just brought her home? Cordelia opened her mouth, and nothing came out. She had prepared 3 or 4 answers for different situations, had rehearsed them in her mind since the previous night, and not one of them could be used for this question. The man didn't wait. He told her she should remember who had started all of this, then ended the call before she could catch her breath. She remained still for a long time with the phone pressed to her ear, even though the line had gone dead. Then she rose, walked around the desk, lowered herself onto one knee, and pulled open the bottom drawer. She had to remove everything lying on top first: old files, an expense ledger, an envelope filled with photographs, and at the very bottom of the drawer, lying flat beneath a layer of cardboard, was a sheet of paper that had yellowed to ivory, its edges slightly curled, its old crease so worn that the fold had faded into a thin white line. She lifted it with both hands. She had held it that way many times over the years, each time telling herself it would be the last, each time standing and walking toward the paper shredder against the wall, and each time stopping halfway before returning it to its place. Because as long as that paper still existed, the man who had just called her would still have to fear her, and she knew very well that the day she no longer frightened him would also be the day she was no longer necessary to anyone. She sank down onto the floor with her back against the side of the desk, the paper resting across her knees, while outside the window the entire city continued playing her face again and again. After the night the white vehicle drove away, Malachi Doyle began everything again from the beginning, and he did it the way a man would who had once made his living investigating insurance claims before entering the world of the Marchetti family, which meant he didn't go looking for anything new. He went looking for what was old and had never been opened. The list of things no one had opened wasn't long, but near the bottom of it was one line that made him stop: the archived footage from the camera system installed around the old house in Pilsen. Elias had never sold that house, never rented it out, and never allowed anyone to live there. He paid the electricity, paid the water, and even paid the service fee to keep the camera data stored, year after year, and in all that time he had never once asked to review a single recording. Malachi asked whether he wanted him to open it. Elias said yes, then sat down and didn't rise again. Searching through the footage took nearly 2 days. The system recorded continuously and faced the front of the house, covering the small yard, the brick walkway, the low iron gate, and part of the porch steps. Malachi divided the data by season, filtered out the periods when motion was detected, then played them at high speed. Tens of thousands of hours passed before his eyes as alternating streaks of light and darkness, mail carriers, falling leaves, snow, sunlight slanting across the yard and then withdrawing, the porch light coming on every evening and turning off every morning. One season layered over another in silence. By the afternoon of the second day, he stopped. The recording he stopped on lasted 11 seconds. It had been captured on a winter night, very late, and there was a woman in the frame. She was thin, so thin that the coat on her body looked as though it had been hung on a hook. She walked up to the iron gate and stopped there. She didn't open it. She stood still and raised her head toward the porch, where the light was still burning as it burned every night. She looked at it for longer than everything that happened afterward. Then she lifted one hand. That hand moved very close to the doorbell button mounted on the gatepost, close enough that in one frame it almost seemed to touch it, and in that moment, everything that was about to happen to the lives of so many people was still within her reach. Then she lowered her hand. She remained there a little longer. After that, she turned away and walked out of the frame toward the left, where the sidewalk disappeared behind the wall. 11 seconds. From the moment she entered the frame until the moment she was gone. Malachi said nothing. He only rewound it to the beginning and let it play once more, then rose from the chair and stepped back so Elias could sit down. Elias watched it to the end, then he rewound it. Then he watched it again. He didn't do it quickly, didn't do it in anger, and didn't say a word. He raised his hand toward the screen at the exact moment her hand rose. then drew it back at the exact moment hers fell, as though if he repeated it enough times, one of those times would turn out differently. Malachi remained in the room for most of the night, then finally went out and sat in the hallway. Through the door, he heard the clicking of the mouse, steady and regular, exactly once every 11 seconds, continuing for hours. There was no sound of a fist striking the table, no sound of anything falling, no one calling anyone's name. There was only that clicking, repeated again and again in a dark room until morning came. What both men understood without either of them saying it was this: Elias himself had ordered that camera system installed. He himself had paid for the storage server. That recording had remained untouched on a hard drive through all those winters, less than a few miles from where he slept, while he paid people to search bus stations, morgues, other cities, and other states. His wife had stood outside the gate of her own home. She had looked directly at the light he had left burning for her. She had reached out her hand, and then she had walked away, and no one in this world knew why. If that recording was real, Malachi thought, then it meant there had been a very long stretch of time when the woman had moved through this city the way any ordinary person moved through a crowd. And if that was true, then it was impossible that no one had ever seen her. What he needed wasn't in the police files. It was in another archive, one Elias himself had created during the first months after that rainy night, and then abandoned as it swelled over the years. The tip line tied to the reward he had offered back then. The amount had been large enough to attract every kind of person. Malachi ordered the entire archive reopened, and what he found was exactly what he had expected. Some people claimed they had seen her in another state. Some said she was living overseas under a different name. Some sent photographs of the back of a long-haired woman in a supermarket. Some called only to curse. There were even people who claimed to have seen her in dreams and demanded payment for it. Thousands of tips like those, arranged in stacks, each one screened, marked, and then closed. Malachi had been reading for nearly an entire day when he reached the one that made him stop. It had come in around the second year, sent by a driver on a late-night bus route. The man had written only a few lines, in poor handwriting, asking for nothing, and what he described was unlike anything else in the entire stack. He wrote that there was a woman who often sat at a bus shelter on Halsted Street very late at night, that she was extremely thin, that her hair had turned white at both temples while the rest was still dark, and that she never asked anyone for money, but simply sat there until nearly dawn. Then he added one final sentence, saying that she wore a small silver bracelet on her wrist, with a charm that looked like some kind of tower, and that he had noticed because she often rubbed it when the weather was cold. Malachi read that sentence 3 times. Then he turned the page over. In the lower right corner was a faded blue ink stamp, stating that the tip was unreliable and had been checked. Beside the stamp were the initials of the person who had handled it, written quickly and at a slight angle, only 2 letters. A and M. Malachi carried the page to Elias and said nothing when he handed it over. Elias read the front first, then turned it over. He held that sheet of paper for a very long time, long enough for Malachi to begin hearing the clock on the wall. Throughout all the years he had searched for his wife, Elias had believed the worst thing was that no one had seen her. He had lived with that thought the way a man lives with a toothache, that a city so crowded could hold not a single pair of eyes that had caught sight of her, that she had dissolved as though she had never existed at all. Now he knew someone had. A man who drove a bus through the night, someone who had never known Elias, had sat down and written these few ugly lines and sent them in, and that man had described the exact bracelet Elias had commissioned for his wife. He had tried to tell him, and the man who had stamped the report, who had written those 2 letters in the corner and placed the page in the discard pile, was the man who had held Elias when he was still a newborn, the man who had called him son from before he could walk until the present day. Malachi let him sit in silence for a while before speaking. He said he had reviewed the way the tips were handled back then, and he didn't believe the man had dismissed this one out of cruelty. He said the notes made it clear that nearly every stack had been rejected almost in full, that by the second year almost everyone in the family had decided the matter was already over, and that a person who had convinced himself it was over would read every new report with only one question in his mind, which was how to eliminate it as quickly as possible. Malachi said it in the calm voice of a man making a professional observation, but when Elias heard it, he placed the page on the table very gently, as though afraid he might tear it, and he didn't speak again for the rest of that evening. Halsted Street led Malachi onward, not to a person but to an address. He traced the list of private nursing facilities that had once operated within walking distance of that bus stop, and among them was one whose name had disappeared several years earlier, immediately after an inspection, whose findings were never made public. The facility had belonged to the chain managed by Cordelia Vance. According to the paperwork, its patient records had been transferred into storage. Malachi went looking for that storage facility and discovered that it didn't exist, that the company supposedly responsible for keeping the records had been dissolved before the contract was even signed, and that every one of those files had been sent somewhere no one could trace anymore. The following night, the two men went there. The building stood back behind a row of trees, its main entrance boarded shut, but the rear entrance from the parking area was secured only by a rusted padlock. Inside, it was dark and dry, the smell of years of dust hanging in the air, and the sweep of their flashlights revealed the things people leave behind when they depart in haste. Several carts lying on their sides, a duty roster still covered with yellowed sheets of paper, plastic slippers scattered in a corner. They walked the length of the main corridor, then turned into the innermost wing, the one without windows facing outside. The last room in that wing was different from all the others. It was smaller. Its door was thicker, and on the inside of that door, there was no handle. Where a handle should have been, there was only a smooth patch of wood with 2 screw holes that had been filled in. Malachi swept his light around the room and saw nothing except an iron bed and a low cabinet placed against the wall on the left. Elias was the one who pulled the cabinet away. Behind it, on the section of wall the cabinet had concealed for all those years, were small marks scratched into the paint with fingernails. They began near the corner of the room, arranged in close, orderly, even groups, one cluster following another along the base of the wall. Then, as they continued, they grew farther apart. There were long, empty spaces between the groups. Some marks were so shallow they were almost invisible unless the light was held very close. Then they stopped entirely, ending in the middle of an unfinished group, followed by a stretch of smooth white wall that continued all the way to the end. Elias didn't count them. He sat down on the floor of that room with his back against the iron bed, and he remained there for a very long time, the flashlight beside him casting its beam at an angle toward the ceiling. Malachi stood outside the doorway from beginning to end and didn't take a single step inside. The night after that, the former manager of the facility was brought into an empty room in the basement of the Belvedere Hotel. He had been living quietly in the suburbs, working an ordinary job, and Malachi's men came for him by knocking on his door and waiting on the porch. No one touched him. No one raised a voice at him. Inside that room there was only a table, 2 chairs, a single light bulb, and 3 things arranged neatly on the tabletop: the facility's financial statements from its final years, information on 2 foreign accounts opened in his name, and a copy of a forged signature he himself had written in another person's place on a treatment consent form. Elias sat in the chair across from him, rested his hands on the table, and said nothing. He didn't ask a single question. He only sat there watching the man, hour after hour, while the night passed outside and no one opened the door. The other man spoke first. Then he continued speaking. By the time dawn was near, he had confessed everything he knew, and when he was led out of the room, he passed Elias without daring to raise his face. The woman, slowly reclaiming her identity as Ada, learned about it that afternoon. No one told her. She merely overheard a few words in the hallway when someone believed she was asleep. She wasn't angry. She didn't ask him why. When he entered her room that evening, as he always did, she rose from her chair and stepped back once, only once, then remained where she was. Elias stopped in the middle of the room. He had seen that look less than a day earlier on the face of the man who had passed him in the basement near dawn, and now it was here, in his wife's eyes. She asked him whether someone had locked her in a room, because she knew things she wasn't supposed to know, and whether the previous night he had kept a man in a room because that man knew things he wasn't supposed to know, and she asked whether he could see how much those 2 things resembled each other. Among the names the former manager revealed that night, there was one he mentioned last and spoke very softly, the name of a nurse who had worked the night shift in the innermost wing, a woman who, according to him, should have been dismissed long before if everyone hadn't been reluctant to trouble an elderly woman nearing retirement. Malachi found the address that morning, a ground-floor apartment in a senior housing complex on the west side of the city, and reported back to Elias. But Elias wasn't the one who entered that room. Ada said she wanted to go. She said she didn't know what she would say. But if the woman saw a man dressed in black walk in first, then nothing would be said at all. Elias remained seated in the hallway, Wilma Pruitt sat at a small table beside the window, with both hands resting on its surface, and those hands were trembling. She didn't look up when Ada entered, and she didn't raise her eyes for most of what followed. She began speaking before anyone asked her a question, like someone who had rehearsed this part in her mind again and again for years, and had only been waiting for someone to come and sit across from her. She said that in the facilities belonging to that chain, pain medication intended for terminal patients had been diluted and divided among more people than the approved quantity allowed, that on paper everyone received the full dosage, while inside the rooms there were nights when no one along the entire corridor could sleep. She said treatments that had never taken place were added to patient records so insurance money could be collected, that the signatures of patients' children appeared on consent forms, even though those children had never set foot inside the facility, and that she had watched people forge those signatures right at the nurses' station, in broad daylight, in front of 2 or 3 other employees. Then she spoke of a young nurse from a community clinic in Pilsen, who had visited the facility several times through a joint program, and who had understood what was happening faster than everyone who had worked there for years. The young woman copied the statements, the forms bearing forged signatures, and the lists of names. She told Wilma that she was going to give those things to someone, that she had to place them directly into that person's hands and couldn't send them. Wilma remembered that rain was coming that day. It was the last time she saw the young woman walk out through the facility doors as a free person. Then she confessed 2 things. The first was about the bracelet. When the woman was brought into the innermost wing under a name that wasn't hers, all her belongings were taken and placed inside an envelope kept in a filing cabinet, and among them was a small silver bracelet. Wilma said that during her night shifts, she kept seeing the patient rub her empty left wrist over and over with her right hand, rubbing it endlessly, even while she slept. And one night Wilma opened the cabinet, took the bracelet from the envelope, and fastened it back around that wrist. She said she was afraid for weeks afterward, but no one noticed, because no one looked closely at the person in that room anymore. She spoke the second thing much more slowly. She said that one winter night, she unlocked the door to the innermost wing and left the rear exit standing open, then walked toward the nurse's station and didn't return. She didn't call the police. She didn't call anyone. She went home, and she slept. She said that for all those years she had told herself she had saved that woman, and that only in the past few days, after seeing the video filmed on the hotel steps, had she finally dared admit to herself that she had abandoned someone on the street. Then she told them the final thing. She said that every day, whenever someone entered the room, they repeated the same sentence to the patient, that her husband himself had signed the papers placing her there, and that no one would ever come to take her home. She said they repeated those words as regularly as they dispensed medication. Ada sat in silence. She didn't remember Wilma Pruitt. She didn't remember that corridor, the filing cabinet, or the night when the door had been left open. But she reached across the table and placed her hands around the 2 trembling hands before her, one resting gently on top and the other supporting them from beneath, exactly the way a hospice nurse holds a patient's hand during the final hours. A gesture her body completed before her mind had time to think. Wilma Pruitt began to cry, and by the time Elias entered the room, the elderly woman had already said she would testify. Not for money, not because anyone had told her she had to, but for one simple reason, that it had been a very long time since anyone had held her hands that way. On the way back from Wilma Pruitt's apartment, Ada sat in silence for most of the journey, then suddenly spoke. And what she said wasn't a question about anything they had just heard. She asked him to take her somewhere she had once eaten breakfast. She said she didn't know the name of the place or where it was, but that if they let her out in the right neighborhood, perhaps her feet would know the way. Elias told the driver to change direction. He had the car stop at the beginning of a street in Pilsen, opened the door, then stepped back so she could get out first. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time, turning slowly and looking toward both ends of the street. Then she began to walk. Elias followed about half a step behind her, offering no directions and reminding her of nothing. She passed a laundromat, turned left at the corner with the fire hydrant, continued straight for another stretch, stopped at an intersection, and looked to the right for a long time before turning. Twice, she slowed down, and then continued. At the end of the 3rd block, she stopped completely in front of a small diner, with a faded awning, and a wooden door worn smooth around the handle. She didn't go inside. She only stood there looking through the glass. The owner, an elderly white-haired man from Northern Europe, who was wiping down a table inside, lifted his head and looked out. He straightened very slowly, still holding the cloth in one hand, then walked to the door, and when he reached it, Doe ripped the frame to keep himself standing. For a long time he couldn't speak. He only looked at her, then down at her wrist, then back up at her face. At last, he said that she had always sat at the second table from the window. Ada turned her head and looked at that table. She didn't remember ever sitting there, but when the old man opened the door and invited her inside, she walked directly to that table and sat in the inside seat with her back to the street. She remained still for a while, both hands resting on the wooden tabletop, then said there had been an envelope. She said she could see it, though not clearly, an envelope tucked beneath the seat of an old piano bench, the kind with a lid that opened so sheet music could be stored inside. She didn't know where the piano was. Elias did. The house in Pilsen remained exactly as it had been on the final day, and when the car stopped outside the gate, the porch light was glowing as it did every night. Ada stood outside the gate for a while before entering, and Elias didn't hurry her. Inside, everything remained in its proper place, with only a thin layer of dust covering the tables and the smell of a house that had stood empty for a long time. She didn't walk toward the piano. She went straight into the kitchen. She moved like someone walking through her own home at midnight, without needing to turn on a light, stopped before the row of drawers beneath the counter, then pulled open the second one, reached inside, and took out 2 spoons. She did it in one continuous motion without hesitating for even a second, and once she was holding both spoons, she froze. She looked at them. She turned them over in her palms. Then she faced Elias and asked why there were 2. Elias stood in the kitchen doorway and couldn't answer. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He could only stare at the 2 spoons in his wife's hands, the 2 spoons she had taken out together every morning for years to stir coffee for both of them, and he couldn't speak a single word until she placed them down on the counter herself. The piano stood in the living room beneath a cloth cover. The bench lid opened with a dry creak. Beneath it, under a stack of old sheet music, was a brown paper envelope. Inside were a memory card, a densely handwritten list of names, and a letter folded in half. Ada picked up the letter, opened it, stared down at the page for a long time, then handed it to him and asked him to read it aloud, because she didn't recognize whose handwriting it was. Elias took it. He quickly read the opening, the part where she had written about what she had discovered, about the names on the list, and about how she no longer knew which of the people around him she could trust. He didn't read that part aloud. He spoke only the final 3 sentences, that she was afraid, that if anything happened to her, he shouldn't search where she disappeared, but where the money flowed, and that no matter what happened, she hoped he wouldn't turn off the light. When Elias folded the letter, a small piece of paper slipped from the innermost crease, a thin, printed sheet folded into quarters, the kind laboratories still used. He picked it up and opened it beneath the desk lamp. At the top of the page was the name of the laboratory. In the middle was the name Adelaine Marchetti, and below it was the result, along with the date of the test, a date that fell during the very week before that rainy Tuesday night. He read the entire page in a single breath, then read it again, and the second time his hands could no longer hold the paper steady. His wife had been pregnant. What she had needed to tell him that night, the things she had said couldn't be discussed over the phone, perhaps hadn't been only the names on that list. Dr. Priya Raghavan came that same evening. She asked Ada's permission to examine her once more thoroughly than the first time, and she made it clear to both of them that she wouldn't say anything until she was certain. The examination took quite a while. When Dr. Raghavan returned to the outer room and sat down, she told them 2 things. First, Ada's body bore unmistakable signs that she had given birth many years earlier. Second, and she emphasized this before saying anything else, every fragmentary record Maliki had managed to gather from the few surviving sources indicated that the child had been born healthy, at full term, in a small maternity facility in the suburbs, and had left with normal vital signs. She said she didn't yet know where the baby had gone afterward, but she knew with certainty that the child had been born safely. Ada listened to everything. She didn't cry. For a long while she didn't ask a single question either. Her hands rested on her knees, and Elias saw them begin to tremble very faintly, the trembling of someone trying to remain still while the ground beneath her feet was shifting. Then she looked up and asked Dr. Raghavan whether the sound of a baby crying that she kept hearing in her mind had been real. She asked calmly, almost cautiously, the way someone asks after living too long with the belief that nothing inside her own mind can be trusted. Dr. Raghavan didn't answer at once. She only said that the human body holds on to far more than people realize. That night, Ada's memory returned. and it didn't return in images. It returned through a scent. She had been sitting by the window when she suddenly sprang to her feet, both hands gripping the arms of the chair, and began speaking in fragments, disjointed and out of order. She spoke of a room so bright that the light hurt her eyes. She spoke of being so exhausted she couldn't lift her head from the pillow. Then she spoke of the smell of jasmine, heavy and sweet, filling the room before anyone even approached. A woman bent over her bed. She couldn't remember the woman's face. She remembered only the voice, a voice so gentle that she had trusted it immediately, the kind of gentleness that made a person stop asking questions. The woman told her she would never see the baby again. She added that remembering wouldn't change anything, that it was better not to think about it anymore, that she should simply rest. Then the woman placed a small folded blanket in her hands and told her to keep it as a remembrance. Ada stopped there and raised both hands to cover her face. Malachi was the first to understand. He went outside, called his men, then returned with an inventory list. Among the few belongings found on the woman called Mira on the night she sat on the hotel steps, apart from the oversized coat and several small things she had picked up from the street, there had been a small piece of fabric yellowed with age, folded into quarters, its creases worn so deeply that they had faded into white lines. It had been stored separately, cleaner than everything else. And the person who prepared the inventory had written a note beside it saying that the item had been folded with great care. Ada didn't remember what that blanket was. She only knew that throughout all the winters she had spent on the street, every morning before getting up, she would take it out, shake it gently, fold it into a neat square, and put it away again, every single day, and she had never once asked herself why she did it. Elias stood against the wall behind them and didn't step forward. He could think of only one thing, that the woman who smelled of jasmine hadn't merely hidden a person away. She had taken from Ada the right to know that she was a mother. Follow where the money went, Adeline had written, and when Malachi traced that flow all the way back to its source, he stopped at an old investment, the original funding for the chain of facilities that would later bear the Vance name. The investment had been approved during the final months of Elias's father's life. Malachi placed the file on the table and said nothing more, because he knew Elias had understood everything from the very first line. Ambrose Marchetti arrived the following afternoon alone, without a lawyer and without anyone accompanying him. He entered the room, looked at the file on the table, then sat down without waiting to be invited. He said he had known this day would come from the night Elias knelt on the hotel steps. Elias asked him only one question: what kind of money had paid to raise him? Ambrose didn't avoid the answer. He said Elias's father had approved that investment, after learning he had little time left, that the old man had wanted to leave his son a stream of money that appeared clean on paper, and that he had never imagined what that money would become after he closed his eyes. Ambrose said he himself had signed the remaining documents. Elias asked why he hadn't stopped it. Ambrose sat in silence for a while, then said that by the time he wanted to stop it, there was already a paper inside Cordelia Vance's drawer, an institutional admission document bearing Elias Marchetti's signature even though Elias had never signed it, and as long as that paper existed, she could destroy him whenever she chose. He said he had lived with that noose around his neck for all those years. Elias asked why it had to be Adeline, and for the first time during the conversation, Ambrose looked directly into his face. He said he had held Elias in his arms when Elias was 3 days old, that he had taught him how to hold a dinner knife, had stood behind him at his father's funeral, and that if he had killed Elias's wife, Elias would have burned down the entire city within 6 months and died before his next birthday. He said a body created a war, while a missing person created only grief, and grief was something people could learn to live with. He said he hadn't saved Adeline, he had saved Elias, and that he had repeated those words to himself every morning for so many years that he had almost come to believe they were true. Elias said nothing. The door behind them opened, and Ada stepped inside. She walked to the table, stood across from Ambrose, and looked at him for a long time before speaking. Then she told them something Elias had never known. She said no one had taken her that night. She said she had called Ambrose herself because she was afraid, not of the names on the list, but of her own husband, afraid that if she handed those documents directly to Elias, he would kill people and lose everything. She said she had believed Ambrose was the only person who could deliver those things to the proper authorities without blood being spilled. She said she had waited for him in the rain. She said she had opened the car door herself. She had climbed inside of her own free will, and she said that was the thing she couldn't forgive. Not in him, but in herself. Ambrose lowered his head and didn't raise it again. Malachi escorted him outside, Immediately afterward, the final piece fell into place. Among the calls Ambrose had made over the years, one number appeared too often for it to be a coincidence, and that number belonged to the private driver, who had worked for Elias for 12 years, the man who had once driven Adeline to work every morning. The man didn't deny it. He sat down with both hands resting on his knees and said he hadn't accepted a single dollar from anyone. He explained that his mother was receiving care at one of the facilities in that chain, that Ambrose controlled her entire treatment record, and that as long as he remained silent, the elderly woman would keep her bed and keep receiving her medication. Then he added one more sentence, that all those years he had believed his mistress was gone, and that his employer had believed the same thing. Elias didn't punish him. He made 2 phone calls, and before dawn, the driver's mother had been transferred to another facility with no connection to that chain. Then he told the man to go home and never return. Afterward, Elias went down to the hotel basement and sat on the stairs, in the very place where for years he had stood and issued orders to half the city, and he remained there for a long time with one thought he couldn't drive away, that the machine hadn't merely crushed people. It had turned each of its victims into an accomplice. By the following morning, Elias already had a list in his mind and an appointment arranged. He intended to handle it the way his father had taught him, the way he had handled things for so many years without failing once, which meant the names in that file would disappear from the city one by one, quietly and without a trace, and within a few months no one would speak of that chain of facilities again. Ada stopped him at the door. She didn't stand in his way. She only asked where he was going, and when he didn't answer, she said she already knew. She told him that if he did it that way, they would disappear, yes, but everything they had done would disappear with them. She said no files would be opened, no one would ever have to answer a single question, and the families who had placed their parents in those facilities would never learn why their loved ones had endured nights when they couldn't sleep. Then she said the thing that truly made him stop. She told him that if he did it his way, she would remain forever the mad woman on the sidewalk, the woman the entire city had watched again and again in a video, and no one would ever hear her speak even once. She said she didn't want him to avenge her. She said she wanted to be heard. Taking a matter like this to a prosecutor was something the unwritten laws of the world Elias had been born into did not permit. It wasn't because anyone felt compassion for Cordelia Vance, but because once that door was opened, no one knew where it would stop. And every name that sat at the same table as Elias had reason to fear it. The meeting took place in the back room of a bakery on the northwest side, a room that had been used for such matters for several decades. 3 men were waiting for him. Elias presented the matter briefly, without pleading and without offering a long explanation. And when he finished, the man at the head of the table, the oldest of the 3, gave a short laugh and said Elias intended to trade away a name. His father had spent his entire life building for a woman who couldn't even remember who he was. He spoke slowly, making certain the other 2 heard him clearly. Elias didn't become angry. He didn't strike the table, didn't rise from his chair, and didn't raise his voice by so much as a single word. He only looked at the man and asked him one question in return, a brief question about a private matter in the man's family, something that had been handled with great secrecy the previous summer, and that no one outside 3 people was ever supposed to know. Elias asked it in an ordinary voice, as though inquiring after someone's health. The man fell silent. The other 2 fell silent as well, and in that stillness all of them understood the same thing, that the man sitting before them still kept a file on every person in that room, that he had kept those files for years without using them once, and that if he chose to do so tonight, this table would not remain intact until morning. Elias allowed the silence to continue a little longer. Then he picked up the silver bracelet from the tabletop, where he had placed it when he first sat down, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and said he no longer used those things. He said he had come to ask, not to force, but he wanted them to remember that he still could. It took the man at the head of the table a moment to recover his voice. Then he named his price. He said that if Elias wanted to open that door, he would have to pay with what had kept it closed for so long, which meant transferring complete control of the harbor district into their hands and stepping down as head of the Marchetti family within 1 year, with a proper successor, a formal announcement, and no foothold left behind. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and waited to see how Elias would bargain. Elias didn't bargain. He agreed at the table without hesitating for even a second, and the speed of his answer made the 3 men look at one another. The man at the head of the table asked whether Elias understood what he had just traded and what he had received in return. Elias stood, fastened the button of his coat, and said that he had traded a name. His father had left him for a name. His wife had been forced to reclaim for herself, and that as far as he was concerned, it was a fair exchange. While the lawyers began preparing the case files to turn over to the prosecutor, Malachi went looking for the last missing part of the story, the part that none of the records from that chain of facilities ever mentioned. He no longer searched there. He searched the adoption system, and he found what he was looking for in less than 2 days, because this time everything was exactly where it belonged. Complete, transparent, properly processed, without a single altered line. A baby girl had been admitted to a major hospital as an unidentified newborn with no known relatives, cared for there for several weeks, then placed with a married couple who had spent years on the waiting list. The husband taught mathematics at a high school, and the wife taught 3rd grade at an elementary school in the western suburbs. Their file was thick and spotless, bearing every required court signature, and inside it was a letter they had written to the adoption agency, containing one sentence that said they didn't need to know where the child had come from. They only needed to know that she would stay. Malachi finished reading the file, then sat in silence for a very long time before taking it to Elias. He told him this was the only part of the entire story that didn't need to be overturned. Ada listened to everything. She didn't ask for a name. She didn't ask for an address. She only asked whether there was some way she could see the girl once, without the girl having to know anything. And so, on a weekday morning, the car stopped at the end of a quiet street in the suburbs, some distance from the schoolyard fence, just as recess began. Ada didn't get out immediately. She sat inside looking through the window for a long while before opening the door, then walked over and stood outside the chain-link fence with both hands in her coat pockets, like any woman who happened to be passing by. The schoolyard was filled with the sounds of children. A group was jumping rope in one corner. Several children were chasing one another around the flagpole, and 2 sat on the steps sharing a bag of cookies. Ada didn't have to search for long. A little girl ran past where she stood, only a few steps from the fence, laughing so loudly that she threw her head back, her hair tied to one side and nearly coming loose. The girl ran to the far end of the yard, turned around, shouted for a friend, then raced back again. Her eyes were green, and when she lifted her face to laugh, there was a small, faint, teardrop-shaped birthmark above her left collarbone. Ada stood motionless. She didn't call out. She didn't raise her hand. She only stood there with one hand resting lightly against the wire fence, while Elias remained several steps behind her and came no closer. The adoptive mother emerged from the hallway on the other side of the yard, apparently between classes, still carrying several notebooks in her arms. She had crossed half the yard when she stopped. She looked toward the fence, looked at the woman standing outside it, then looked at the little girl running across the yard, and finally looked toward the fence once more. She placed the notebooks on the steps and walked directly to the gate. She didn't ask who Ada was. She only stopped on the inside of the fence, leaving some distance between them. And the first thing she said was that the girl's name was Junie, that she was 4 years old, that she woke earlier than both of her parents, and that she wouldn't eat carrots under any circumstances. Ada nodded and couldn't speak. Then the adoptive mother said something Ada would repeat many times in the years that followed. She said that all those years, they had never believed they were keeping the girl in someone else's place, and now that they knew there truly was someone, she wanted to make one thing clear. They weren't keeping Junie from Ada, they were keeping her for Ada. Ada covered her mouth with one hand for a moment before she could speak. She said she hadn't come to take anything back. She said she still couldn't remember her own name, still needed someone else to read her own handwriting to her, still startled at the sound of a key turning in a lock, and that a person like her had nothing to offer the girl yet. Then she asked permission to remain there a little longer. The adoptive mother nodded, stepped back into the schoolyard, and said nothing more. Ada stood there until the bell rang, and every child in the yard rushed back inside. The entire case file had been copied several times and submitted to the prosecutor's office weeks earlier. The memory card had been examined by experts. The financial statements were already in the hands of 3 separate legal teams, and no one could do anything to stop those documents now. But Malachi Doyle knew exactly where the only remaining weakness lay, and he knew because it was the very weakness he would have targeted if he had been standing on the other side. That stack of papers said there were forged signatures on the treatment consent forms. But signatures could always be disputed. One expert opinion could always be challenged by another, and the entire case would remain nothing more than a dead stack of paper unless a living person stepped forward, sat down, and said that she had seen with her own eyes someone signing another person's name. There was only one such person, and she was nearly 70 years old. On the morning of the hearing, the car arrived to collect Wilma Pruitt much earlier than the appointed time, exactly as Malachi had planned and calculated again and again. He sat in the front seat. The journey was uneventful until they reached the bridge. Then traffic slowed, then stopped completely, and after that it didn't move another yard. Something was blocking the far end of the bridge. People said a truck had broken down sideways across 2 lanes. No one could see clearly. The radio said the road would be cleared within an hour. Malachi looked at the clock on the dashboard, then out at the line of vehicles stretching ahead, and he didn't say what he was thinking. He simply opened the door and stepped out. The wheelchair was taken from the trunk, unfolded, and locked in place, and Malachi lifted the elderly woman into it with his own hands, as carefully as someone setting down something fragile. She asked what he intended to do. He said he intended to take her on foot. Then he pushed the wheelchair onto the sidewalk and began walking. The sidewalk across the bridge was narrow. The river wind blew against them, and the concrete rose unevenly at every expansion joint, making the old woman bounce each time the wheels crossed one. Malachi moved as quickly as he dared. He had to weave around pedestrians who had stopped to see what was happening at the far end of the bridge, pause at 2 places where there were steps, lift the entire wheelchair off the ground, and set it down again. He checked the watch on his wrist after every stretch, and each time he looked, he walked a little faster. No one followed them. There was no sound behind them. There was only the wind, the horns rising from the motionless line of traffic, and the sound of the wheels rolling over concrete. After they had gone some distance, Wilma spoke. She didn't ask about the traffic jam. She didn't ask why a truck had broken down sideways across the bridge on this particular morning. She only gripped both sides of the chair, raised her head, and asked whether they would send her home if she arrived late. Malachi told her no one was going to send her home. She said she wasn't certain. She said she had once watched them refuse to let an elderly woman enter a room simply because she had arrived after the appointed time. Then she fell silent for a while, and when she spoke again, her voice was much softer. She said she had been silent for many years. She said she had been silent for so long that she could no longer remember what it felt like not to carry something hidden inside her. Then she said she didn't want to remain silent today, and that she was afraid of only one thing, that after taking all those years to make her decision, she might arrive a few minutes too late. Malachi didn't answer. He only tightened his hands around the handles and kept walking. They reached the bottom of the bridge, crossed 2 intersections, and at the final corner another car was waiting with its door open. When Malachi pushed the wheelchair into the lobby of the Belvedere Hotel, the clock on the wall showed only a few minutes remaining before the appointed time, and Wilma Pruitt raised one hand to straighten her collar before allowing them to wheel her inside. The public hearing of the Task Force Against Elder Abuse was held in the grand ballroom of the Belvedere Hotel. Not because anyone wanted to create a spectacle, but simply because it was the only place in the city large enough to hold everyone who wished to attend. Family members began arriving early that morning and filled every row of seats, many of them carrying photographs of their parents on their laps. Cordelia Vance was required to attend as the head of the legal entity under investigation. She arrived late, dressed in white, walking between 2 lawyers, and took her place in the front row with her back held straight, like someone attending an awards ceremony. The evidence was presented one piece at a time, slowly and without drama, following the measured rhythm such hearings always took. Medication statements were compared with treatment records. Procedures had been billed even though no one remembered them ever taking place. Money flowed out of insurance payments, passed through 3 separate legal entities, then finally reached its destination. Then came the signatures. Treatment consent forms bearing the signatures of patients' children were displayed on the screen, and from the audience, a man suddenly rose to his feet and said he had never once entered that facility, that he had been on the opposite coast on the date written on the document. And finally, there was another paper. The sheet that had yellowed to ivory and bore a fold worn into a thin white line, recovered from the bottom drawer in Cordelia's own office. It was an involuntary treatment admission form, bearing the name of a woman who wasn't Adeline, and at the bottom of the page was the signature of Elias Marchetti, a signature he had never written. The presenter said only one thing, that this document had given the people in that facility the authority to repeat to the patient in the innermost wing every day that her husband had signed the papers placing her there. Cordelia laughed. She said anyone could pull an old paper from some forgotten drawer. She said the entire story had been manufactured by a family whose way of making money was known to half the city. Then she turned toward the rows of people and asked whether those sitting there truly intended to believe the word of someone who had slept on the streets for all those years. Ada stood. She didn't shout. She walked to the front, then turned to face the entire room. And her voice was so steady that those in the last row had to hold their breath to hear every word. She said that yes, she had slept on the streets. She said she had sat at bus shelters until morning, had lived through every kind of winter the city could give her. And throughout all those years, thousands of people passed her every day. She said she didn't believe any of them were cruel. They simply didn't look. Then she said that was exactly what the people behind all of this had relied upon. Not her silence, but the fact that no one would bother to look at a woman like her, because they understood very well that a woman dressed respectably would always be heard sooner than a woman who slept on someone else's porch. Then she raised her left wrist before everyone. She said she had forgotten where her home was, had forgotten her husband's name, and on some mornings had even forgotten her own, but she had never once taken off that bracelet. She said there was an inscription engraved around the inside, saying that no matter how long the night might be, he would still leave the light on for her. She said she couldn't remember who had engraved it or why it was there, but throughout all those years, some part of her had known that somewhere, someone was still leaving a light on, and that part of her had kept her alive. The entire ballroom fell silent. Then Wilma Pruitt's wheelchair was pushed to the front. The elderly woman spoke slowly, sometimes pausing to catch her breath, and she told them everything, hiding nothing, including the part about herself. Before the hearing ended, Ambrose Marchetti was escorted from the room by two people in plain clothes, right through the center of the ballroom, passing in front of everyone who had ever sat at the same table with him. He looked at no one. When Cordelia's turn came to be taken away, she didn't look at Ada even once. She turned her head toward Elias and said that for all those years she had stood beside him, attended meetings in his place, rebuilt his name after he himself had burned it down, and remained late into the night in rooms everyone else had already abandoned. Then she said that in all that time, he had never once looked at her, that he had only ever looked at a gate and a light. The chain of facilities bearing the Vance name was suspended that very week, then dissolved after the investigation expanded to every one of its branches, and for the first time, the families who had entrusted their parents to those places were allowed to read their loved ones' true records. Elias Marchetti stepped down as head of the family within the time he had promised, leaving no foothold behind, and on the day he signed the transfer papers, no photographs were taken and no public statement was issued. The grand ballroom of the Belvedere Hotel, the place the entire city had once watched again and again in a video, was transformed by him into the headquarters of a foundation called The Light Still Burns. The foundation did three things. The first was to maintain a team devoted to finding missing people within the homeless community, people whose files had long since settled at the bottom of forgotten stacks of paperwork. The second was to provide a shelter reserved for women who could no longer remember who they were, a place where no door had its handle removed from the inside. The third was an independent oversight program for elder care facilities, carried out by people from outside the industry who arrived without warning and without prior notice. Some said he did those things to atone for his own failures. He never denied it, not even once. Ada returned to her old profession at the beginning of spring, working a few shifts each week at a care center near Pilsen. She still startled at the sound of a key turning in a lock. She still hid leftover bread in a kitchen drawer without being able to explain why. But she was very good at her work, good in a way no school could ever teach, and people began calling for her whenever a patient entered the final hours of life. During one shift, she sat beside the bed of an elderly man who could barely see anymore. She held his hand as she always did, one of hers resting gently on top, the other supporting it from beneath. The old man remained silent for a long time, then suddenly tightened his fingers around hers and asked whether it was truly her. He said he remembered those hands. He said she was the nurse who had sat with his wife throughout her final night, the nurse who had sung softly to her when he no longer had the strength to sing, and he told her that he hadn't been able to see her face clearly even back then. But he remembered her hands. The first person in the world to recognize Adeline Marchetti didn't recognize her with his eyes, but through the very hands she had spent her life using to hold on to others. Sunday afternoons at the home of the schoolteacher couple in the suburbs began slowly, once each week, with no one rushing anything. Junie called her Miss Ada, and what the little girl loved most was showing her the pictures she had drawn. One afternoon, she handed Ada a sheet of paper with a small house beneath a red roof and a round yellow light above the door. shaded more deeply than everything else on the page. Ada asked why she had drawn the light, and the girl answered with perfect simplicity that she had drawn it for someone who was on the way home. That evening, as the two of them sat on the steps of the house in Pilsen, Elias finally spoke of something Maliki had understood long before but had never asked about. He told her that throughout all those years, once every year, he had quietly paid the renewal fee for his wife's nursing license. He said he hadn't done it because he still held on to hope. He said he simply couldn't bear the thought that one day someone might cross her name off some list, because as long as that name remained somewhere in the city, she still existed. Ada sat in silence for a very long time, then said that throughout all those years, somewhere there had still been a piece of paper saying she was real, while she herself had known nothing about it. And in the end, that very piece of paper, that very pain he had refused to release, had been the thing that recognized her. The night was cool, and she reached over and took his hand, and her hand didn't tremble. She looked at the porch light and told him he could turn it off now, because she was home. He answered that he would leave it on, in case there ever came a day when she forgot again. This story leaves us with one very simple truth that we so often forget. A person's dignity doesn't live in the clothes they wear, nor in the address where they sleep each night. We don't need to know who someone once was, what they once possessed, or whom they once belonged to, before we treat them with kindness. And sometimes, what saves an entire life isn't power or money, but simply one person willing to stop, look directly into another person's eyes, and not turn away. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day, more meaningful stories can reach more people. How did the story of Adeline and Elias make you feel? And what would you do if you passed someone sitting silently beside the road? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what is in the deepest part of your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in each passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.